Welcome back to the Authentically Broken Your Pain Has Purpose podcast. For those of you who are returning, thank you for choosing to stick with me on this journey of discovery. And for anyone who is new to the show, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. And I hope that you find this a place where you feel comfortable, you feel like we're family, and this becomes a home for you as well as those who've decided to join me on this journey. And I want to encourage you, if you're new, to go back and watch the first episode, which was the introductory episode, because it's going to lay the foundation for what this podcast is all about. Every show that we're going to do, the meaning behind it, why we're going the direction we're going, it's going to help you understand that. But it's also going to help you understand what we're going to discuss today on a deeper level. It's going to make sense on a deeper level than if you just watch this podcast by itself. Make sense? Now, for everyone, whether you're returning or you're new, you're going to find that this podcast and what we're going to do in our time together in this show is that we're going to build brick by brick each week as we go. Think of it as we are building an emotional and a spiritual home. And so we laid the foundation last week. Now we're going to start going brick by brick and building it. And it's a process, and it's a step-by-step process. So you're going to find that there's a reason why I'm going to talk about the things I'm going to talk about in the order I'm going to talk about them. Because we have to start at the foundation and build up before we can add on. Because there are certain things that have to come first before other things can come. Hopefully that makes sense. So although each show is going to be about something new and different, and you can absolutely watch each show without having seen any of the previous shows or episodes. You absolutely can. However, you're going to find you're going to get the most out of each week's episodes if you're familiar with what's already been discussed in the previous weeks because of what I just talked about that we are building as we go. So with that said, for everyone returning and for the new family joining us, for those of you returning, you're going to understand what I'm saying here. But do you remember last week how we discussed that intimate connection needs to take place in order to have any type of authentic and meaningful relationship in this life? Do you remember we talked about that? It all starts with intimate connection. That happens first to have a meaningful and authentic relationship. There's a lot of relationships we can have. We're not talking about those. We're talking about meaningful ones. And I think it's safe for me to say that all of us want meaningful relationships in this life. So if that's the case, here's something we must consider. The harsh reality that comes with meaningful relationships is not only the probability, but the inevitability of deep heartache and pain. It's going to come. You see, it's that bittersweet nature of this precious thing called intimacy in a broken world. It's just the way it works. So friends, if I'm being honest, and you can probably tell this by looking at me, I know I look tired and exhausted, and there's a reason. It's because I am. This past week has been really hard for me. It's been a really hard week. Anybody else have a hard week? And when I say hard, I don't mean hard in the sense of there was an obstacle you had to get past at work, or your kids just made life harder for whatever reason this week, or you had a blow up with a spouse or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about when I say hard. I'm talking about the hard that comes your way that cuts deep emotionally, mentally, spiritually, because it's an attack of some sort or struggle of some sort on the things most precious to you in your life. That's the type of hard week I had. And what was going on, it was hard due to the very thing we're going to be discussing today. Without going into detail on this podcast, because now it's not the appropriate time, I have a family member of mine who's been living with me due to a serious life-challenging, I should say, illness. And they were hospitalized due to complications with their condition. And they were in the hospital for about a week, and they were just released. And it's still very serious and touch and go. And so that's why it was a hard week for me. And as I discussed in the book, relationships are full of ups and downs, good and bad, heartache and joy, laughter and tears, struggle and victory. All relationships worth having have all that in them. So this means that we're going to have to navigate pain, heartache, and being uncomfortable in order to have meaningful relationships. And this past week was a reminder of this for me, but it was also a stark reminder that pain, heartache, and suffering They don't just come here and there throughout our life and then disappear, never to be seen or dealt with again. We would love for that to be the truth. And a lot of times I think we convince ourselves that's the truth. I've dealt with that once. I won't have to deal with it again, or I won't see it again, or at least not on that level. But that's just not true, friends. The hard and ugly truth of life in a broken world is that pain and suffering will come, and it's going to come in waves and seasons throughout our life. No matter how hard we try to prevent it or how well we think we have prepared for it, they're going to come. And in my experience, quite often, they come in a season and a time when we least expect it, or at the very minimum, we aren't prepared for their arrival. And that was me this past week. And I can tell you it never gets easier. And with each experience of pain and heartache, a new wound that will leave a scar of some sort is created in our hearts and souls. It's just the way it works. And for me, this really hits home because, like I said last week, and if you know my story, when I lost, or after I lost my husband, brother, and mom in those 14 months, I really lost all my remaining family. So this family member is the last family member that I really was in a relationship with left. So that's a totally different scar and wound for me now coming up. So why is this? Why does it never get easier? And why with each new experience of heartache and pain, is there a new wound that creates a scar for us? Well, the answer is layered and it has to be unpacked. But if we just get down to the core and really simplify it in maybe a sentence of why this is the way it is, here's what I would say. This happens because the only way we can experience meaningful relationships is to be authentic and vulnerable with others, which in turn requires us to fully give of ourselves. So in other words, when we fully give and we do that, friends, we're exposed. Now, when we say that word, or when I said it, or when you hear it, we tend to only have one understanding and one connotation, which tends to be negative or not favorable when we think about that. Would you agree with me? So what I want us to do is I want us to talk about what it means to be exposed. Okay? Listen to the definition of the word expose. Now, for my friends that are listening, or those of you who know me, you're like, oh my goodness, here she goes again. She loves her some Merriam-Webster. Why, yes, I do. But here's why I like talking about definitions of words. Because I believe words matter. Because I believe words carry power. Therefore, the meaning of words matters. So let's talk about what it means to be exposed. Here's the definition. To deprive of shelter, to deprive of protection or care. To submit or make accessible to a particular action or influence. To leave out in the open. Did you hear those definitions? Now, in the context of having a meaningful and authentic relationship, this is a great and a wonderful thing, right? Because it allows us to be open in order to receive the love, joy, peace, and contentment that comes with being in this type of relationship. So it's beautiful. However, at the same time, it also leaves us open to, think of the definition of expose, it exposes us to, so leaves us open to, or makes us accessible to, the potential for pain, heartache, and suffering that come with that exposure from complete vulnerability. This is another example of what we talked about last week with the both and in life versus the either or. Remember, we said there's a lot of either ors in life, but there's also quite a few both ands. This is one of those both ands. You cannot make yourself open to having a meaningful relationship without also exposing yourself to the potential for heartache. The two go hand in hand because we live in a broken world. We don't have to like it. It just is what it is. So we are choosing to potentially experience that when we choose to fully love and fully give. You see, the fact that being exposed opens us up to the good and the bad in this life is one of, if not the main reason, most of us will avoid being fully exposed. Because our nature is to self-protect, self-preserve. That's our instinct. So we may open up a lot, but very rarely do we fully open it? And so let's talk about that. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it both? Is it just that we need to understand if it's a bad thing, why it is, or if it's a good thing? Well, let's unpack. And in doing that, we're going to unpack the importance of and the need for relationships today and why they are central to everything for us. So, in order to understand where we're going, I want us to start and really understand this one central truth. And here it is. Since everything in our existence centers around relationships, if we don't get relationships right, if we don't understand and get this right, we will never be able to find contentment, joy, and peace in this life. Did you hear that? Let me say that once more. I want you to really hear it and think about it. Since everything in our existence centers around relationships, if we don't get this right, if we don't really understand how to do this in an authentic and meaningful way, we will never be able to find true, because there's a lot of false out there that looks like it's true. We will never be able to find true contentment, joy, and peace in this life. But even more, we won't be able to find life itself, because life itself is wrapped up in it. And we're going to dig into that more a little bit today, but especially as we go forward. So then, why are we so bad at relationships overall as humans? If that is true, why are we so bad at it? Because I would make the argument that we are. Now, some of you may be thinking, Vicky, speak for yourself. I'm not bad at relationships. I mean, I'm not perfect, but mine are pretty solid. I don't really have issues here. If that is you, can I just say, I would love to meet you and learn your secret? Because the rest of us, we're in need of some first aid, or at the very least, constructive instruction and guidance in this area. I mean, if we get honest, and if we're really honest with ourselves, because none of us are perfect, and if you didn't need help in this area, that would make you perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and argue we all need this. And I'm putting myself in that category too, right? Because I'm an imperfect human too. We need guidance in this area, but also understand, I'm talking about humanity in this world as a whole. I'm not just talking about you or me. I'm talking about humanity as a whole. We're really bad at it. But second to that point, just like last week, I want to challenge you to stay here with me in case you're still not fully convinced or you're thinking, no, that may be true for some, but not me. Okay, then I want to challenge you to stay with me here and just be willing to keep peeling back the layers on this a little more with me today. And then just see if you still believe that at the end of it, if it still holds up to water, if it sinks or swims. Can we do that? Because the goal of this time in the discussion isn't to blame or shame anyone. I'm going to say that again. Hear me. The goal of this discussion isn't to blame or shame anyone, because we are all in the same boat. So then, instead, what are we doing? Well, instead, it's meant to shine light into the deepest layers of our hearts and our minds in order to expose what is actually taking place versus what we think is taking place. We're really good at convincing ourselves of what is taking place, and a lot of times not being aware of what the reality is, or ignoring the reality because we're good at twisting it. And if you think about that with me long enough, you know that's true. So we need to do this. We need to peel back these layers, because here's the thing. You can't fix what you won't acknowledge. If you won't acknowledge it's an issue, you can never fix it. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this concept. We're going to go much deeper into this in a future show. But here's the thing. We had to talk about it today, because unless we can see that a problem exists, the choice to choose to change can't exist. And I want you to catch what I said. It's a choice to choose to change, which means you have control over what you do with it. And the only way we can see problems that tend to be tucked deep under the bed sheets of our hearts and minds, because man, we will tuck stuff away and we will layer it so well. The only way to see those problems is to start removing those layers of protection that we have put in place to hide the issues that are there. And keep this in mind, most often, this is done subconsciously. And we do it for what we consider to be our protection, right? We don't understand that it's harmful to us. We think we're doing it to protect ourselves because it's just too painful or we don't want to deal with it. But nonetheless, we put layers on those issues. We don't deal with them. We hide them. We have to start peeling it back one at a time. And that's what we're going to do today. So are you ready? Here we go. If, as the title of this show suggests today, and the title is It's All About Relationship, if this is true, then life cannot be all about you and your needs, and life can't be all about me and my needs. Meaning, if we're looking at ourselves, we have to say, life cannot be all about me. Why? You're thinking, but my needs are important. And if my needs aren't met, I can't meet someone else's. So how can it be about me? I didn't say it isn't about you. I said it can't be all about you. Why? Because that would be a one-sided or a lopsided relationship. Wouldn't you agree? If it's all about one person, that's lopsided. That would be like the teeter-totter, just having one person on one side. Or your backside is always going to be on the ground because there's nothing on the other side to balance it out. Makes sense? Everybody with me? And this is also what any relational therapist worth their credentials would call a toxic relationship. And I think we'd all agree. Actually, did anyone immediately picture someone or think of a relationship that maybe you've been in or you know about when I said the phrase toxic relationship? I think we all know what that looks like, and we can actually picture it because we've seen it. Almost all of us would agree with the premise that a one-sided relationship is not healthy, and therefore it's toxic. Let me give you an example. I know you know what I'm talking about, but I want us to really picture this, so let me give you an example. Now, for whatever reason, when I think about this particular topic or I talk about it, I immediately picture someone at the very beginning of exploring the possibility of a dating relationship with someone they're interested in, which for most of us begins with the first date. Now, unless you are that rare person who met your future spouse in kindergarten, and I know they exist, and you always knew you would marry them, which is so sweet and great, and I really think it is, but it actually makes me wonder what your parents taught you or had you do as a young child that made you so emotionally mature at such a young age. While Vicky at that age, well, I was eating Play-Doh because apparently I needed more salt in my diet. Yes, for all of you going, what? I literally would do that sometimes. And by the way, it wasn't gobs. I wasn't just sitting there eating Play-Doh for dinner. Okay, so for anybody going, wow, she's crazy, calm down, slow down, slow your roll. That's not what I'm saying. But I was curious what it tasted like. It smelled. I thought, well, it doesn't look too bad. I'm making pretend pizza with it. Why not try it? And the first time I did, I was pleasantly surprised. I was like, it kind of tastes good because it has salt in it to make it. Anyways, you don't do the smartest things when you're kids. Don't judge. I know somebody else out there did it. Or judge. I don't care. Just don't tell me. Anyways, maybe that's why my drummer marches a little sideways. I don't know, but I digress. For those of you who are mature, emotionally mature enough to know you just found the person you were going to marry, I was eating plate, whatever. So I wasn't that emotionally mature. So for people like me, we have to go on dates. And I think that's where most of you are. Anyway, to get back to the point is that most of us go on a first date to explore the possibility of a potential relationship with someone that we're interested in. Or at the very least, we're going to have some type of one-on-one interaction or activity to see if this person is someone we want to pursue. So with that said, for this example, I want us to run with the first date scenario. So let's say you're on a first date with someone and you're out there, let's say you're having dinner, you're sitting across the table with them so you can have a conversation and get to know them. What if during the dinner and the conversation, you notice they spend the majority of the time talking about themselves, their life, and their interests? What would you think? How would you feel? Would that be positive? Would that be earning points for wanting to move forward at all? So sometimes you just have those people, but then there's another level of person. So what if they're doing that? But on top of that, anytime they actually stop to ask you about yourself, when you gave them an answer, they found a way to direct the conversation back towards themselves because they have a similar or better story than yours. Oh, y'all know what I'm talking about. The one-uppers in life, we've all met them. And hopefully we haven't been them. But you know what I'm talking about. Those one-uppers. So those are those people who have gone through what you've gone through, but they've gone through more. They know what you know, but they know more. And they've been through what you've been through, but they've been through worse. Or Maybe they're not a one-upper. Maybe they don't do that, this person you're on the date with. But the majority of their interest and direction in the conversation always seems to find its way back to being about them in their life. Either way, most of us, if we all were on a first date like this, most of us would leave no room for a future date. But some of us, and this includes myself, because I know my personality, we probably wouldn't even make it through that entire day without finding a way to find the nearest exit possible as fast as possible. So here's the thing. Hopefully, this doesn't describe any of you listening or watching, but even if it does, or if some of us can be or we have been this person at times, which I told you I'm going to be authentic and honest. I believe there have been times in my life where I've been that person. It's not a pretty picture, and it's not something you want to think about our own. Because when we talk about it, it's pretty ugly to look at, and we don't want that to be us. But maybe that's been you, or maybe it is you. Well, if either one of those are the case, we should probably be asking ourselves, why do we do this? If we don't even want to see it, much less picture ourselves that way, then why do we do this? Because we're all prone to it. What makes people behave and think this way? Simply put, there's a lot to it, but if we just break it down and boil it down to the bare essentials, a person behaves this way because they have their eyes, their heart, and their mind focused on themselves at all times. Their central focus is here. Please hear me now. A lot of the times, actually most of the time, people are not even aware they are doing this or that they're perceived this way. Because any rational person who was not literally crazy or delusional would not want to be perceived that way. So nobody who's rational is going to behave that way intentionally. It's not done intentionally, but the intentions don't matter. What happens is what matters. It's a subconscious choice and a subconscious path to this behavior. Therefore, the fact that it's completely self-centered and thoughtless to the people doing it, that's not even on their radar. They don't even know they're doing it. Now, here's the twist in all this, and I kind of touched on it a little bit. Are you ready? This actually describes all of us at different points in our lives in regards to relationship. We have all been that person in some way, shape, or form in at least one type of relationship or more in our life. If we are being honest, the answer is yes for each of us. This is a big deal. You see, not only are we all capable of being completely self-focused and a taker or a leech in a relationship and how we approach and interact with others, but we all will do this in this life at some point in time or another. So what is the difference between those who slip up when they get overwhelmed and they just become self-focused and they're a taker, only a taker, not a giver? What is the difference between the people who end up going that way versus those who that's all they do and they never change? The difference is those who only slip up and it's not a lifestyle, but it's a slip up here and there, they have learned and they have chosen to acknowledge this side of our humanity, that it exists. And even harder, they've allowed that darker, selfish side that's possible for all of us to be exposed. Remember we talked about what that word meant earlier? They've allowed that to be exposed to the light of truth. And then they've allowed the truth to break them. They've allowed to be broken by it in the healthy way we discussed last week. Because not only must you be exposed, but you have to allow the truth to break you, to break that bad part of you so that you can rightly be put back together and rightly relate to and experience meaningful relationship in this life. Got to be broken out of us. And we have to be reshaped. Because once again, we live in a broken world. So in turn, that broken world creates brokenness by wreaking havoc on all the things that are subject to it. And we as humans are subject to it. So we are all broken people at the heart of our very nature. And if that weren't true, we would be perfect. and brokenness wouldn't exist anywhere in anything. But perfection in this world doesn't exist because perfection in people don't exist. They go hand in hand. Now, another reason we can be so bad at relationships, and actually to add to this selfish nature of ours, whose main goal is self-preservation, which it is, we also tend to only have and use faulty and broken, and in turn, unhealthy relationships. That tends to be the only thing we use as our gauge by which we measure and try to determine what an authentic and healthy relationship can and should be. So we are using a broken, faulty gauge to try to determine what a perfect or authentic or non-broken relationship should look like. Doesn't make sense, does it? But that's what we do. Think about this with me for a minute, okay? Let's unpack this. If an imperfect world means imperfect people who make mistakes, then imperfect relationships are going to be the result from that. Can we agree on that? That's a logical path to follow, and it's true. That is just the way it is in a fallen, broken world. We don't have to like it. We shouldn't like it, as a matter of fact, but that's just the way it is. Therefore, why would we ever think that another human being or human relationship would make a right gauge or standard for understanding what an authentically healthy relationship should look like? Why would you use something that's broken to try to understand something that shouldn't be broken, that should be complete? Doesn't make sense because it doesn't work. And the best example and comparison I can give to explain this, it's actually rooted in science. It really is. We're going back to science here. And it's not going to be too technical. It's actually really simple, and it's actually foundational to science. The world of science runs on and hinges on something called the scientific method. Now, you may not be familiar with that, and many of you may never have even heard of it because our society has stopped teaching literal science, which is objective, by the way, and turned it into a subjective circus of nonsense these days. But I digress. A lot of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you may be like, what? Don't worry. There's a lot of nonsense going on because science is objective by its nature. But thankfully, when I was in school, we don't need to talk about how long ago that was. And yes, the alphabet was around. But when I was in school, the foundation was still taught as just a foundational truth that undergirds any and all scientific books. And that's what I want to talk about. So here's what the scientific method says. It starts with what is called a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess. Now, did you hear those two terms? Notice I said an educated guess. Hypothesis is making a guess at what something is, but it is educated, meaning that you are using reasonable observations and logic. Remember I said last week, we're not to turn off our brain to believe in God? You don't do that with science either, as so many people have done these days, and that's the direction it's going. An educated guess means that you're using reasonable observations and logic. And when you do that, you have come to a reasonable assumption of a truth, and you want to test it. That's what a hypothesis is. So once you have a valid hypothesis, a valid educated guess, based on that definition, now you want to move into creating what's called a theory. That's the next step. It's critical to understand that a theory is just that. It is theoretical in nature, okay? Meaning that it is an educated guess that needs to be repeatedly tested to see if it always holds true no matter what. A theory can only go beyond a theory if it always holds true to the premise you are presuming. So whatever you are saying you think is true has to always be true and cannot be disproven to move beyond a theory. Is everybody with me on this? And I find that most people operate off an incorrect definition and understanding of what a theory actually is, which is why I'm explaining this to you. As a matter of fact, almost all of the concepts and teachings in the scientific world end up remaining theories. Did you know that? Like more than 95%. And it's because very few things can be consistently proven time and time again and never disproven. Notice the specific wording I used. Consistently proven and never disproven. However, once a theory has been consistently proven many times over and over under various conditions that are trying to prove it false, and it can't be proven false, then and only then can it be made a law, which is the final step. So you go from hypothesis to theory to law. There are very few laws in the scientific world for the reasons I just laid out. Why? Because a law must remain constant in its state of being. A law remains constant in its state of being, no matter what. Meaning, as it was created, it will always be, irregardless of any outside influences that come against it. The best example I can give you is the law of gravity. Gravity always exists. Now, we can do things that change the effects that gravity has on us, but we can't do anything that changes gravity itself. So why am I mentioning all this, and what the stink does it have to do with relationships? I promise you it ties in, but I wanted us to have a good understanding of that because it's the best example I can give to explain why using faulty, broken relationships as our gauge doesn't work. Here's a problem all of us have, okay? And here's how it correlates. Because most of us only have, and therefore only use, broken, faulty, or unhealthy relationships as our gauge, or what the scientific world would call our constant, what doesn't change, because whatever you use as a gauge should never change. So because most of us only have and use these broken, faulty relationships as our constant, by which we're measuring to determine what an authentic and healthy relationship should be, the result is dysfunctional at best and at worst destructive, because it can't be anything, because it's not a true, unblemished relationship to give us a good gauge. Does this make sense? Here's the thing. If the gauge, or as it's called in the scientific world, the constant by which we measure and determine what an authentic and healthy relationship should be, if that is in and of itself imperfect, faulty, and impure, and every human being is, so every human relationship is, if we use that as our gauge, then we will never be able to rightly discern any relationship that we hold up to it. We can't. If we're using faulty, then we're only comparing faulty to faulty. This means that anything that is impure, meaning not perfect, cannot be the standard by which we measure what an authentically healthy relationship should be. And I'm going to break down what this is. Since people aren't perfect, we can't measure our relationships against other people's relationships, or even against other relationships that we deem good in our own lives. This can only be comparison. Here's why. And it never, ever works, because we're different people with different personalities, different life experiences, who have faced different and varying situations in life. Comparison is always the enemy of growth towards a good and healthy in life. Because you're comparing from not a perfect position, you're comparing from a healthy position. That's why it doesn't work. Just like in the world of science, a constant is the standard that is used in an experiment by which to measure the results of your experiment against in order to see if that theory can be a law. So this means that the constant, and it's named that for a reason, constant, it must be just that. Always the same, never changing no matter what, perfect in its state. So if there's no human relationship that can do that, you may be thinking, okay, Vicki, I get that, but what do we do? You've pretty much just said there's no way to do this. I know that's what you're hearing, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's not possible to do comparing to other human relationships. Stay with me. So then how do we navigate this thing called relationships? And what is the standard that we should be measuring our relationships by in order to find the authentic and meaningful connections that we all seek, we all need, and we all want? That is actually the correct question we have to ask ourselves in order to find truth that leads to life itself, not just healthy relationships, but that actually leads to life. And in turn, meaningful relationships with others. So here's what I want to say. I want to encourage all of you to really sit and think about and chew on what we just discussed. And we're going to go more in depth so that we're not here all day in this conversation. We talked about the what and the why. There's a way to go more in depth in the how, but I do want to talk about the relationship that we should be comparing to isn't human. Because if you remember what I said next week, or last week, excuse me, that we were created for relationships of all kinds, but first and foremost, a relationship with our creator, which I will call the vertical relationship, as well as a relationship with others, which is the horizontal relationship in life. Friends, I will say this before we wrap up today. Unless and until this vertical relationship is corrected and gets in a place where it is rightly aligned, these horizontal relationships with others will never be what they were meant to be and what they can be. This has to be correct first, because until your relationship with your creator is correct, you can't rightly understand yourself. And if you can't rightly understand yourself, you can't rightly relate to others. That's simple logic. So again, I encourage you to really sit and think about what we just talked about and chew on it. Now, if you want to know more about, okay, I hear what you're saying, that's starting to make sense, but how do we do this? How do I go about that? As well as you want to learn more about the actual constant that I just mentioned, a relationship with your creator, then I'm going to encourage you to visit my website at authenticallybroken.com. I have a screenshot of it up there so you can see what the homepage looks like. And on that website, you will be able to grab a copy of the book, Stop, Drop, and Deal, where I dive into all this more in detail, where you can really sit and spend more time going into not only the what and the why, but the how on that. And you can see a picture on the screen right beside that. So you see what the book looks like and you can get your copy there. Now, if you're enjoying this podcast and you're enjoying having this place to come, then I encourage you to share it with a friend or two. Pay it forward, because friends, we all know people that are hurting. And man, it seems like maybe I'm just a one-off in this, but I can tell you literally every week, and now it's moving into every few days, I'm hearing stories from friends and people that I know where things are happening and people are being hurt on deep levels and they're being broken and they're having things hit them from out of nowhere and they're not sure how to deal. So whether you are aware of it or not, there are people around you who may be looking for and they need help and they just don't feel like they have a place to go. Maybe this can be a starting place or an ending place for them. So I encourage you to share this with some people. If it's helping you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Now let's keep building our community of like-minded family so that we can be that support for one another. And that's actually what sharing does. So I want us to build this and to grow. Thank you for being willing to dig deep today. And as we keep seeking out the road that leads to life, joy, and peace, we're going to keep going deeper. And I promise you, it's going to get thicker. So if you're thinking, yeah, this is just basic, we're starting here because we're starting to build the layers, but I promise you it's going to get deep. So just stay with me. We have to be willing to start here. Now, I know that it may feel as if we're crawling or moving at a snail's pace as we travel, but the reality is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And when it comes to our hearts and our spirits and hurt and pain, if you try to sprint through it, you'll never get to where you want to go. And you'll actually find yourself having to start all over. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So we're moving at the pace we need to. And it's because most of us have so much baggage, hurt, and pain that we have buried deep under various cloaks of some kind that it's going to take time and patience to expose it all, so that we can see and know what we're actually dealing with. Because most of us aren't even aware of what we actually need to deal with. And then once we do that, then we have to make the choice to actually deal with it. But here's what I can promise you. I can't promise you results. Nobody can. You have to make the choice. But here's what I can promise you. That if you don't give up and you keep showing up with a genuine willingness to face and tackle whatever surfaces as you seek the truth, because you're actually willing to let the truth do what it does, and not interfere and not bring your preconceived ideas and your beliefs, but just let truth be true. And not even try to define what truth is, because it stands alone. If you will be willing to do that, I can promise you, you will find your way onto the road that leads to life everlasting. And that is where peace not only begins and ends, but that's where it reigns. And that's the goal, to get there. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for being willing to do this. And I hope that you come back next week and I hope that you stick with it. And like I said, think about sharing this with other people you think who may be able to get something out of it. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys.